So how are standalone components built? Well, it turns out that you just build a regular component as you already know it, and then you add a special property, a special flag to the object that is passed to the add component decorator. And that's the standalone flag, which is a Boolean, which should be true. False is the default and does not have to be added. True sets this to be a standalone component. And internally, this will change many things. Because now this component can be used in other components without declaring it, though you still need to make Angular aware of it. If you change this to true and you save this, you will note that now the app fails. It fails because this is now a standalone component, but it is still declared in ng-module, and that is wrong. Because now when you switch this to standalone, you should no longer declare such a component, in this case the details component, in any ng-modules. So therefore here we should get rid of it, remove it from the declarations array, and remove the import. With that, if we save this, it kind of works, but it's actually gone. We no longer see the details part down there. Now we also don't see an error in the console, but it's gone. The reason for that is that it's actually not yet known by Angular. Now all Angular sees is that in the welcome component there is an unknown HTML element, and therefore it does not output anything. Because yes, we as a developer know that details component is the element or the component with that selector, but Angular doesn't know that. Because even if you switch to standalone components, you still must make Angular aware of those components, but you don't have to do it in a module anymore, at least not necessarily. Instead, what you have to do is you have to go to the component that should use this standalone component. And of course, one standalone component could be used in multiple components. But here we only have one component that's using app details, and that's the welcome component. So we have to go to that component, and there we have to add an imports property to this object that's passed to the component decorator. And here we have to point at the standalone components we want to use in this component. So in this case, I want to use the details component, hence I point at it by importing details component and adding it here. However, you'll note that if I now save this, it indeed fails because this imports property can only be set if the welcome component is also a standalone component, which it is not. Now we'll switch it to a standalone component in the future. For the moment, let's instead get rid of that here by commenting it out, and let's find a different way. Because I did mention before that one good thing about standalone components is that you can combine them with ng-modules so that you can migrate to standalone components in a smooth way. You don't have to rewrite your entire application. Instead, you can start switching individual components to standalone components and still use them in your other components that are part of ng-modules. If you want to use a standalone component in the various components that make up a module, all you have to do is go to that module, in this case the app module, and now instead of adding the standalone component here to declarations, you add it to imports. In the past, you typically added other modules here. Now, with the introduction of this standalone components, directives, and pipes feature, you add all your standalone components, directives, or pipes that should be usable by the other components of this module here to this imports array. So in this case, details component, which now also must be imported here. It's imported and then added to imports here. With that, everything compiles and we see our standalone component again. And if I open the console, you see that clicks are also still registered and all of that works except for the custom directive. That does not work. The highlighting is gone. Now we'll fix this in a second, but before we fix it, let me come back to this app module. What's the idea of standalone components if we still have to add them here? I mean, the only thing that changed is that we now add them in a different place here in the app module, and we now actually have more code to write because we did have to add this standalone flag to the details component. Well, this is only the case because this standalone component only gets used in one other component, which is part of an ng module. So we're in the middle of a migration process here. It will be less code if you only have standalone components, or if you have a standalone component that's used in a bunch of other standalone components. Here we have the worst of both worlds, so we didn't actually gain anything yet, but we'll get there over the next minutes. This is, however, how we can add such a standalone component, and therefore in the essence, all you have to do is set this flag and then add it to imports either in an ng module, or if welcome component would be a standalone component itself, here with help of imports like this. But that is something I'll get back to. Before we get back to this, let's make sure that our custom directive is working again though. Our custom directive is not working anymore because whilst I do still use it here in the template of my details component, this component is a standalone component and therefore decoupled from an ng module. Yes, it still has to be imported there, but it's not aware of any other things that might be made available by that module. Specifically, the details component does not know about the shared module because it's only imported into this module, it's not receiving anything from that module. It is, however, the shared module that has my highlights directive. Now, what if I want to use this directive here in the details component? Well, there are two possible solutions. We could turn the highlight directive into a standalone directive, because standalone directives can be imported into any other components where we want to use them, including standalone components. But let's say that's not an option yet. We need to keep it in this module right now because we're in the middle of a migration process and we don't want to turn this directive into a standalone directive yet. Well, that's no problem because in my standalone component, the details component here, I can add the imports property, which I already mentioned before. And you cannot just import other standalone components or directives that should be usable inside of that component's template, but you can also import other modules. As I mentioned, you can combine standalone components, directives, and pipes with ng modules just as you need it so that you can have a smooth migration process. So here I can import the shared module like this, add the import up here and add it to imports here. And with that, if I save this, this works again. I got my styling back because my highlight directive is now doing its job again, because now the standalone component knows about this module and about the things exported by that module, like the highlight directive, and therefore the directive is able to work again. Now, as a side effect, since in this simple demo app, the details component is the only component that uses this directive, I can actually get rid of the shared module here in the app module because the other two components in there are not using anything from that module. If they would be using anything from that module, we of course would have to keep the shared module import here, but with this demo app, we can get rid of the import here and we don't have to add it to imports here, and the app still works. The directive is still doing its job because now my standalone component, the details component, is directly importing that shared module. So that's now how we can get started with that. But we're still in the middle of our migration process here, learning about standalone components and how we can blend them into an existing module-based Angular app, which is important because for the near future, that is what you're most likely going to do. And even in the long-term future, you will always work on some Angular applications that will use modules but want to move to standalone components or simply want to use both. And that is absolutely possible. But now let's actually dig deeper into standalone components and let's migrate all these components to standalone components so that we can see how that will work. So in order to migrate everything to standalone components and directives and so on, let's actually continue with the highlight directive. This directive is exported by the shared module, but in this demo app, we only use that module and that directive in the details component, which already is a standalone component. Since that is the case, we could actually turn this highlight directive into a standalone directive by also adding the standalone flag to the directive decorator object like this. So just as components, directives, and actually also pipes can be turned into standalone building blocks. In this case, I'm turning the directive into a standalone directive. Now, with it turned into a standalone directive, it must no longer be added to any declarations in any modules, and therefore here in this demo app, we can actually get rid of the shared module altogether therefore, because we don't need it anymore. Now in the details component, we are of course using that shared module, so we should get rid of the import. And instead here, in the imports array of the details component, we should import the highlight directive itself. Because that's important. When you are working with standalone components, standalone directives, and so on, then you always must import them into the other components where you want to use them, or with imports into the modules where you want to use them, as shown before. It's not enough to just add this flag, you also need to import the things, the directives and components you want to use in other components into those other components. So in this case, I want to use the highlight directive in the details component because I'm using it here in my template. Hence, I have to add it to imports like this. But with that flag added here to the directive and the directive added here and the shared module gone because we don't need it anymore, everything works as before. We also got no error here. And we are now using this component successfully. And we now migrated another building block to be standalone. So now that we also migrated this directive, let's migrate more components. And the next step probably would be to migrate the welcome component. Now here in this component, we therefore also turn this to standalone by setting standalone to true. And now we can re-add this import and also add details component to imports here because, as mentioned before, if you want to use a standalone component or directive in another component, you have to add it to the imports array of that component. In this case, the welcome component wants to use app details, so we have to add details component here as an import to the file and then mention it here in the imports array of this component. Now with that, it will fail, however. Now for one, we now should remove details component from imports here, not because it's needed technically, but because in this module, we only added it because the welcome component needed the details component. But since the welcome component is now itself specifying the details component already, we no longer have to do that here in the module because the app component is not using it. If it would be, we would keep it here, but since it's not, we can remove it here and remove this. But that's not the reason for the error. The reason for the error is that the welcome component, of course, must not be added to declarations anymore because it is now standalone. We added this flag to it after all. Now we have to do what we did before, therefore, instead of adding it to declarations, we should add it to imports. And with that, we migrated another component successfully and the app still works.